Welcome back to our short history of the ideas and events that led to the West's de-Christianization. When we left our story, Europe was reeling from the savage wars of religion, which came out of the Reformation. The Scientific Revolution, a 200-year period from the 15th to the 17th century, when the foundations of modern science were laid, suggested a possible way out of the conflict. The Scientific Revolution overturned the Christian cosmos, a hierarchical model of reality in which all things existed organically through their relationship to God, in favor of a mechanical universe ordered by the laws of nature with no necessary grounding in the transcendent. Now, most leaders of the Scientific Revolution were in fact professing Christians, but the revolution's grounding lay undeniably in nominalism. If the material world could be studied and understood on its own without reference to God, then science could exist on its own, free of theological controversy. And science worked in practical ways. The early scientists believed that the point of science was to master nature to relieve human suffering. Now, this was a turning point in the history of ideas. The natural world was no longer to be taken as something to be contemplated as in any way an icon of the divine, but rather as something to be understood and manipulated by the will of humankind for its own sake. In this way, the Scientific Revolution further distanced God from creation in the minds of men. The revolution culminated in the life and work of Sir Isaac Newton, a mathematician and unorthodox Christian who fabricated a new model of the universe that explained its physical workings in a wholly mechanical way. Newton's God was like a divine watchmaker who fashioned a timepiece, wound it up, and let it carry on without his further involvement. The explosion of science changed Western epistemology, which is the study of how we know what we know. The French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes, with his famous principle, "I think, therefore I am," revolutionized thought by making the autonomous, thinking individual the determiner of truth. Descartes' philosophy opened the door to the world-changing project dubbed the Enlightenment. At its core, the Enlightenment was an attempt by European intellectuals to find a common basis outside of religion for determining moral truth. The philosophers of the Enlightenment sought to use reason alone to establish a new basis for political and social life, one that was separated from the past. They tried to create a secular morality that any reasonable person could understand and affirm, and they believed that this was possible. They also advocated science and technology as a way to impose man's will upon nature and extolled the freely choosing individual. For our purposes, the Enlightenment matters because it was the decisive break with the Christian legacy of the West. God, if they mentioned him at all, was not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the vague, rationalistic divinity of the deists. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th century led to mass migrations from the countryside into the cities. Both the French and the American revolutions at the end of that century signaled the coming of a new political order. In the 19th century, the atheistic philosophy of Marxism arose to radically challenge the established Western order. Meanwhile, in the world of art, the Romantics championed emotion and personal freedom. And in the world of ideas, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution dynamited Christian confidence among elites. Later that century, Friedrich Nietzsche, surveying the rubble, said, "God is dead, and we have killed him." Despite the disillusionment of artists, philosophers, and other culture producers, the 19th century was a time of great religious fervor in England and America. The 20th century arrived amid a wave of optimism about the West's future. It was a time of hope and faith in progress. That dream came to a catastrophic end in 1914 with the outbreak of the deadliest war the world had ever seen. The mass savagery of World War I shattered European ideals and dealt a mortal blow to what remained of Christendom. The war's aftermath accelerated the abandonment of traditional sources of cultural authority. Sexual morality loosened. New styles of art and literature arose, making a conscious and definitive break with the discredited values of the pre-war world. Western civilization had been abandoning Christianity for quite some time, but it still had a sense of progress and purpose to unify it and to give its people direction and order to their lives. But all the apparent gifts of scientific, political, and social advances led to a charnel house that killed 18 million Europeans in only 4 years. The emergence of Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, marked the death of religious man and the birth of psychological man. Religious man looked for holiness and salvation. Psychological man sought happiness and pleasure. In Freud's vision, we should stop the pointless searching for our non-existent source of meaning and instead seek self-fulfillment. The pursuit of happiness was not a quest for unity with God or sacrificial dedication to a cause greater than oneself, but rather a search to satisfy the self. The 1960s was the decade in which psychological man came fully into his own. It was in the 60s that the freedom of the individual to fulfill his own desires became our cultural lodestar, and the rapid falling away of American morality from its Christian ideal came as a result. The great cultural critic Philip Rieff saw it all coming. In the 1960s, he said, "A culture begins to die when its normative institutions fail to communicate ideals in ways that remain compelling, especially to the cultural elites themselves." In other words, the Judeo-Christian culture of the West was dying because it no longer deeply believed in Christian sacred order. What made our condition so revolutionary, said Rieff, was that for the first time in history, the West was attempting to build a culture on the absence of belief in a higher order that commanded our obedience. In other words, we were creating an anti-culture, one that made the foundation for a stable culture impossible. The romantic ideal of the self-created man finds its fulfillment in the newest vanguards of the sexual revolution, transgendered people. They refuse to be bound by biology and have behind them an elite movement teaching new generations of children that gender is whatever the choosing individual wants it to be. So, to recap, 1,000 years ago, the Christian world was united, and all within it knew that God was everywhere present and filled all things. Today, Christianity has been badly fractured and is trying to stay alive in a culture that idealizes the autonomous, freely choosing individual, finding meaning in no one but himself and his desires. Christianity has collapsed in Europe, and it's in steep decline in the United States. If Christianity goes, so goes the civilization that it built. And that's why we're living in a time comparable to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. St. Benedict of Nursia and his monastic movement emerged from that rubble with a way of life capable of keeping the faith alive in the hearts of men and within communities. What can we learn from the rule of St. Benedict? We will explore that question when we next meet.